When German prisoners were first marched into the heart of rural America, they expected hostility. These were farmers, after all, men whose sons were fighting overseas, whose families read newspapers filled with headlines of German advances and atrocities. Surely they would spit at the sight of captured enemies working their fields. But what unfolded between the fences and furrows was something so improbable that many prisoners never dared to record it fully in letters home. Some did not even speak of it until decades later. For hidden beneath the surface of discipline and watchtowers, a quiet, forbidden friendship took root. The story began with labor. By 1944, America's war machine pulled millions of young men overseas. Farms were left short of hands. Crops could not wait for soldiers to return. The government struck an uneasy balance. Prisoners of war would be leased as laborers, working under guard on American farms. It was a policy meant to fill gaps, nothing more. Yet the men who climbed into trucks each morning to be driven beyond the barbed wire discovered something unexpected: humanity. At first, suspicion hung in the air. The farmers stood stiff, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. Their wives lingered near windows, their children peered from porches. The prisoners moved in silence, shoulders hunched, expecting blows or curses. But when the first tools were handed over, hoes, shovels, baskets, the moment changed. The prisoners bent to work, and the farmers watched. Muscles strained, sweat poured, the earth was turned. Hours passed, and slowly something shifted. These were not faceless enemies. These were men who knew soil, who knew labor, who could coax crops from the ground. Farmers recognized the rhythm of fellow workers. One farmer's diary, discovered years later, captured the moment. They work like us, their backs bend, their hands callous. I wanted to hate thee, but hate does not plough a field. I gave them water, they said thank you, in German. I nodded. Perhaps that was the first crack in the wall. The prisoners too felt the thaw. One wrote secretly, "The farmer handed me an apple at noon. He did not speak, but his eyes softened. It was the first kindness I had seen in months. I ate slowly, afraid it might vanish." From such small gestures, trust grew. It was never spoken aloud. To admit it openly was dangerous. Guards patrolled, regulations forbade familiarity. Farmers, too, feared the judgment of neighbors. But within the lines of duty, moments blossomed. A farmer might leave an extra slice of bread on a table. A prisoner might fix a broken hinge on a barn without being asked. Wives began to send pies or jars of preserves, set down with the same casualness one uses to hide generosity. Children, once warned to stay away, crept closer, curious. By midsummer, conversations sprouted in halting exchanges. A farmer asked the German word for plough. A prisoner pointed to a stalk and muttered, "Mais." The farmer repeated it, grinning. Slowly, a vocabulary was built. Bread, cow, water, thank you. These words bridged more than language. They bridged humanity. Yet secrecy was essential. Letters home were censored. The prisoners could never write, "We worked with American farmers today. They treated us kindly." Such words would be blackened out, or worse, used against their families. The farmers, too, kept silent. To say aloud that they had grown fond of their enemies was to invite suspicion, even accusation. And so the friendships lived in silence, in nods, in bread passed hand to hand. One afternoon, a storm rolled suddenly across the plains. The sky darkened, the wind rose, and rain came down in torrents. The prisoners and farmers together rushed to secure the barns, to cover equipment, to save the animals. In the chaos, distinctions blurred. Men shouted to one another, not as guard and captive, but as neighbors fighting the same storm. When it passed, they stood soaked, breathing hard, and for a moment they laughed. Laughter born not of sides, but of shared survival. A guard barked at them to separate, but the sound of that laughter lingered in memory for years. What startled the prisoners most was the dignity given them. They were not beaten, not mocked. They were worked, yes, and watched. but they were also treated, in quiet ways, as men. Farmers asked about their skill with tools, their methods of planting. One prisoner, once a carpenter, mended a fence so skillfully that the farmer clapped his shoulder in approval before catching himself. Such a gesture was dangerous, yet it spoke volumes. The farmers, for their part, found themselves challenged by their own hearts. How to hate men who sang softly while they worked, songs of homes far across the ocean. How to despise men who spoke of families with the same longing in their eyes. They had been told these were monsters, Nazis bent on destruction. But under the sun, with soil beneath fingernails, the truth looked different. The children noticed first. They were fearless in ways adults could not afford to be. They played near the fields, daring to wave, daring to mimic German words. A prisoner carved a small toy horse from scrap wood and handed it quietly to a boy who had been watching him work. The boy's face lit up, and though his mother scolded him for taking it, she did not return it. That toy horse remained in the family for decades, silent proof of a friendship unspoken. Back in the barracks, the prisoners whispered of these encounters. Some felt guilt, as though kindness from the enemy betrayed their homeland. Others clung to it as proof that the world was not as cruel as war made it seem. One wrote, "The farmer treats me better than my officers ever did. How strange is war, that we find humanity only in the hands of those we were told to kill." The secret friendships grew in small, invisible ways. A jar of jam slipped into a lunch basket, a handful of tobacco left on a fence post, a handshake too quick for the guards to notice. Nothing grand, nothing recorded, but everything remembered. And so, by the harvest season, a truth had settled in the hearts of both sides. They were enemies by circumstance, not by nature. Farmers needed hands, prisoners needed dignity. Together, in silence and secrecy, they built something forbidden but real: friendship. But friendship in war is fragile, easily broken, easily punished, and both sides knew that discovery could bring consequences, so they kept it hidden, buried beneath the rhythms of work and the silence of letters. A secret carried in glances, in laughter held back, in the knowledge that even in the darkest war, human beings could still find one another across the lines. The first harvest was the test. By late summer, the wheat stood golden and tall, swaying under a wide sky. German prisoners, marched to the fields under the wary eyes of guards, expected drudgery and disdain. Instead, they found themselves at the center of an unspoken pact. The farmers needed their hands, the prisoners needed dignity. As scythes cut through stalks and wagons filled with grain, the rhythm of labor dissolved barriers more effectively than speeches ever could. The farmers had learned by then that the Germans were not useless. They were skilled, many of them sons of farmers back home. They bent to work with practiced motion, and though some slowed from hunger or fatigue, others carried themselves with quiet pride. A farmer named Wilkins, tall and hard-eyed, had resisted at first. He had lost a nephew in North Africa. To him, these men were killers. Yet when one of the prisoners repaired his broken plough with deft precision, something cracked in him. That evening he left a jar of preserved peaches on the workbench. He never said it was for them, but the prisoners ate it slowly, one spoon at a time, savoring not just the sweetness but the silent acknowledgement behind it. From that moment, these tiny exchanges multiplied: a slice of cornbread wrapped in cloth, a cigarette tucked beneath a stone near the fence, a prisoner carving a replacement handle for a tool without being asked. These were gestures of friendship disguised as necessity, masked as coincidence. Both sides knew better, but neither dared name it. To name it was to risk losing it. The guards pretended not to notice. Some were too young to care, others too weary to enforce every rule. They had seen the prisoners work hard, sweat pouring from their backs. They had seen the farmers nod in grudging approval. Why break something that kept the peace? Yet the regulations were clear: no fraternization. If an officer inspected and found evidence of undue familiarity, punishments would fall. So secrecy became the lifeline. The friendships deepened not only through work, but through storms, accidents, and long days in the sun. One afternoon, a mule bolted while hauling a wagon. A prisoner leapt forward, grabbing the reins, calming the beast before it trampled a child standing nearby. The farmer's wife, pale with fear, pressed her hand to her mouth. Later, when no guard was near, she slipped the prisoner a loaf of fresh bread. He bowed his head, unable to speak, his throat thick with emotion. That night he wrote, "I saved a child today. For this I was given bread warm from the oven. It tasted of home." The children were the boldest bridge. While adults carried the weight of shame and suspicion, children saw only men who could carve toys, sing songs, or smile. They lingered at the edges of the fields, asking names, repeating German words with clumsy enthusiasm. A boy of 10 asked one prisoner how to say friend. The man whispered, "Freund." The boy repeated it again and again, his face beaming. Later he drew it in the dirt with a stick. That word lingered longer than the harvest itself. Still, the risk was constant. One prisoner was caught accepting a note slipped by a farmer's daughter. The contents remain unknown, perhaps only a thank you, perhaps something more, but discovery led to punishment. He was removed from farm duty, confined to camp for weeks. The others whispered of him at night, angry at his recklessness, yet secretly admiring his bravery. For even a note, a scrap of paper, carried the weight of recognition. You are not only a prisoner, you are a man. The secrecy became a bond in itself. Every loaf of bread passed, every word exchanged, every nod across a field was part of a hidden network of trust. The prisoners wrote nothing in their letters home, for censors would erase it. Instead, they buried the truth in diaries hidden beneath mattresses or tucked into cracks in barracks' walls. Farmers, too, said little even to neighbours. To admit fondness for Germans was to invite gossip, suspicion, even accusations of disloyalty. And so, silence covered friendship like soil covers seeds. Autumn came, bringing cold winds. Harvests ended, but the need for labour did not. Prisoners shifted to repairing fences, chopping wood, tending livestock. These tasks brought more moments of quiet connection. A farmer's hand brushing a prisoner's as he passed a tool. A child sitting near a prisoner carving a toy, watching with wide eyes. A guard pretending not to notice the exchange of a cigarette. Each moment was fleeting, but together they built something lasting. One prisoner, once a school teacher in Hamburg, taught a farmer's son how to whittle. The boy returned the next day with his own attempt, clumsy but eager. The prisoner corrected his grip, smiling despite the danger. That evening he told his bunkmates, "For a moment I was a teacher again, not a captive." His eyes shone with something more than pride. It was the flicker of dignity restored. Winter deepened the secrecy. Snow fell across fields, and the prisoners laboured in biting cold. Farmers, pitying them, sometimes allowed them to warm by kitchen stoves for a few minutes. Officially forbidden, these moments carried risk, but also warmth, literal and human. One prisoner described stepping into a farmhouse, smelling soup simmering, seeing children gathered by the fire. He wrote, "I stood like a ghost in another man's life. For a moment I belonged to something human again. Then the guard called me out." The farmers' wives played a subtle role. While some remained distant, others found ways to soften the prisoners' days. A scarf left on a fence post, an extra biscuit tucked into a basket, a kind glance when no one was looking. These small gestures were never spoken of, yet they carried enormous weight. For men torn from their homes, from their own wives and children, such moments felt like reminders that they had not vanished as human beings. As winter gave way to spring, the secret friendships had become part of daily life. They were not open, they were not declared, but they lived in every shared glance, every hidden gift, every unspoken understanding. The guards may have seen only labourers and captives, but beneath the surface, a bond was forming that neither fences nor regulations could entirely erase. Yet both Sidi Khan's knew this bond was fragile. A single accusation, a single report could end it. And so they kept it hidden, not out of shame, but out of fear. The farmers did not want to lose the workers who had become, in their way, companions. The prisoners did not want to lose the fragments of dignity and humanity that came with being treated as more than numbers. Silence was survival, and survival was friendship unspoken. It was this silence that later gave their memories such power. For when the war ended and the prisoners returned home, many carried these hidden bonds like contraband in their hearts. They spoke of them only in whispers, if at all. For to say aloud that they had found kindness, even friendship, among their captors was to risk disbelief, even condemnation. And yet the truth lived on in diaries, in carved toys preserved by American families, in the memories of children who grew old and remembered the strange men who once worked their fields and gave them gifts of wood and laughter. By the time spring ploughing began, both prisoners and farmers had come to accept this secret as part of life. They worked together day after day, side by side. They never named it, they never confessed it, but in the silence between them lay something more enduring than orders or fences, the fragile, forbidden truth that enemies had become, if not friends, then something close enough to leave a mark forever. The last year of captivity unfolded with an odd familiarity. The Germans awoke each morning to roll calls, ate their rationed breakfasts, climbed into trucks, and rattled down dirt roads toward the farms where work awaited. The routines had become so ingrained that sometimes the prisoners forgot they were still captives. The barbed wire and the rifles were reminders, yes, but the soil beneath their hands felt no different from the soil back home, and the people they worked best with no longer looked only like enemies. By 1945, what had once been suspicion had become something subtler, something so fragile it could barely be named. Harvest season returned, and with it the intensity of labour. Wheat, corn, cotton, all demanded hands. The farmers depended on the prisoners now, perhaps more than they admitted aloud. Their own sons were still overseas, some never to return. These German men, once sworn to destroy America, had become the muscle that kept families afloat. That dependence forged bonds that were undeniable, though still unspoken. The friendships were tested in countless ways. One morning, a prisoner collapsed in the field from exhaustion. Before the guard could even step forward, the farmer himself rushed to the man's side, kneeling in the dirt, pouring water from his own flask onto cracked lips. The guards looked away, unwilling to record the gesture. Later, the farmer muttered gruffly, "Back to work tomorrow." But the prisoners knew what it meant. It was not pity, it was care. Another time, when a wagon broke down, a prisoner with a background in mechanics repaired it with speed and skill. The farmer, watching closely, finally said aloud, "You've saved me a week's work." His voice carried no malice, only gratitude. The prisoner returned to camp that evening walking taller, as though the recognition itself had restored a piece of him stripped away by war. The children were growing too. Boys who had once watched from fences now joined their fathers in the fields, lifting loads alongside the prisoners. Girls brought baskets of food, no longer shy, smiling when the Germans nodded thanks. Some even dared to speak phrases in German, words they had picked up by listening. A boy shouted, "Danke!" as he tossed a prisoner an apple, and laughter rippled across the rows. For that brief moment, the weight of war lifted, replaced by something startlingly close to joy. But secrecy remained essential. Everyone knew the rules. Guards tolerated small kindnesses, but anything beyond could bring punishment. And so friendship existed in glances, in shared labour, in silence. A farmer's wife might slip an extra biscuit into a lunch basket, never acknowledging it aloud. A prisoner might leave a carved trinket on a fence post, walking away before anyone noticed. These gestures were brief, but their memory endured. As the war dragged toward its end, rumors of Germany's collapse reached the camps. The prisoners heard of bombings, of starvation, of cities reduced to rubble. Letters from home, when they arrived at all, were filled with veiled desperation. Mothers spoke of children too weak to walk to school. Wives wrote of shortages, of fear. The Germans carried these letters to the fields, their hands trembling, their hearts heavy. And then they saw the American children again, tall, rosy-cheeked, full of life, and the contrast cut deeper than any wound. They could not say it aloud, but in their eyes was the knowledge. Their homeland's future was crumbling, while America's was thriving. This realization only deepened the secret friendships. Farmers and prisoners no longer saw only enemies. They saw fathers and sons, men who worried about children on opposite sides of the ocean. They shared no words of comfort, language and regulation forbade it, but their silences grew heavy with understanding. A farmer might pause in his work, glance toward a prisoner bent under the sun, and both would know what the other carried in his heart. One prisoner recorded in his hidden diary, "Today the farmer wiped his brow and looked at me. For a moment we were not enemies. We were fathers, each fearing for our children. He said nothing. Neither did I. But I will never forget that silence." As victory for the Allies became inevitable, the question of return loomed. The prisoners would go home, but what would home be? The friendships they had built here could not follow them. They would be erased by oceans, by censors, by governments that demanded enmity. And so, as the last seasons passed, these bonds became more precious. Every day in the fields was both a gift and a countdown. The final harvest brought scenes of quiet poignancy. Farmers shook hands with prisoners when guards weren't watching. Wives said scarves or gloves into calloused palms, whispering nothing but looking long enough to speak volumes. Children cried when they realized the men they had grown used to seeing would soon vanish. One little girl clutched a carved toy horse, refusing to let it go as trucks carried the prisoners back toward the camps for the last time. Departure came swiftly. Orders arrived. The Germans would be repatriated. The farmers gathered near the camps, some openly, others lingering on roadsides. They watched as trucks rolled past, carrying away the men who had ploughed their fields, repaired their barns, laughed with their children. Some raised hands in brief, hesitant waves. The prisoners, crammed into trucks, risked small nods in return. It was all they could give. One prisoner wrote later, "I left behind more than labor. I left behind a friend I never named. We never spoke the word. But he gave me bread, and I gave him my strength, and between us grew something that even war could not destroy." Back in Germany, silence swallowed these stories. To speak of kindness from Americans was dangerous, even unthinkable. Families who had suffered bombings and hunger did not want to hear of friendships with the enemy, and so most men kept quiet. They returned to ruins, to rebuilding, to lives where the secret remained locked away. Only in old age, when the weight of years loosened tongues, did some confess to children and grandchildren what had really happened. That behind barbed wire, in the soil of foreign fields, they had found not just survival but humanity. American farmers carried the memories too. In their barns and attics, toys carved by prisoners remained, tucked into boxes. Old diaries spoke of the Germans who worked well, who laughed, who looked so young. Some families even kept in touch, sending letters across the ocean once peace returned, though most did not. For many, the friendships lived only in memory, a secret folded into the fabric of their lives. Historians rarely wrote of these bonds. Official accounts focused on battles, generals, treaties. But in the quiet spaces of war, another truth endured. Men who should have remained enemies instead built something fragile and forbidden. Friendship. Not declared, not celebrated, not recorded in official histories, but lived. For the prisoners, the shock was never that Americans had power. That much they knew. The true shock was that American farmers, whose sons were dying overseas, could still see them as men, still share bread, still offer kindness in small, dangerous ways. That realization cut through propaganda more deeply than defeat itself. It stayed with them long after the war ended. Decades later, reunions occurred. Former prisoners returned to the towns where they had once labored. Old farmers shook their hands, now frail and trembling, but still carrying the memory of strong grips across wheat fields. Children who had once been boys and girls returned as grown men and women, showing the toys carved by strangers who had once been their enemies. Smiles broke across wrinkled faces. Tears fell. And at last, words were spoken that had been buried in silence. Friend. The story of German POWs and American farmers is not one of treaties or victories. It is the story of plows, of bread, of laughter hidden in fields, of friendships never written in letters but carved into memory. For in the end, what these men carried home was not just the shame of defeat or the censored, the scars of captivity. They carried the proof that even in war, even in enemy soil, humanity could find a way to bloom, quietly, secretly, like a flower pressed between the pages of a diary.